why animals? Out of all the social support systems you could have studied, why did you become interested in the role of pets and companion animals and how they play in the lives of people with mental health conditions?
It's quite simple, really. So I've always been interested in how people manage their health conditions, not necessarily just themselves, but in collaboration or conjunction with the people, places, and things around them. So we had a number of projects that were looking at that, and it became very clear very quickly how important people felt that their animals were in relation to that work. So we were able and lucky enough to be able to focus on that in a bit more detail. So we're really driven by what people were telling us. So it came from speaking to people with lived experience of physical and mental health problems.
Do you have pets yourself?
I don't. So I didn't then. So it started quite a while ago. I've since had two dogs in the interim. So I don't know which came first, really, the pets. I think it was the research that came first before I got the dog. So they kind of encouraged me to get pets myself.
Awesome, awesome. I mean, yeah, I love animals. So when I came across your review, it was interesting because it makes sense that
Mm,
animals can provide you with this sense of security and this sort of emotional security as well, and they can really help you through times of of difficult times of
mm.
your life. When you started studying this area, did people take it seriously? Because I mean, maybe some people out there being like, well, it's kind of common sense, animals and mental health, but I think there's more to it.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. Some of it is common sense, especially if
Hmm.
you've got an animal yourself, you can understand and appreciate that. I think where we were coming from, I speaking to people, it might be common sense to people with animals, but I think people in the health profession don't often acknowledge that.
Hmm.
So whilst
Hmm.
it was kind of feels like it's common sense, there wasn't very much literature out there to support it in an evidence-based way. And people's voices weren't really being heard in that arena in terms of what was important to them. I think that was why it was important for us to do. There were some colleagues initially that were like, "You're doing what?" So I think we've had that initial like, "That's interesting." It probably people thought it was a little bit niche, but actually, in terms of the research that I've published over the years of my career, these papers have by far been the most covered by the press, but also people have emailed me or written me letters just to thank me for doing the research because it really resonated with their experiences and they felt like their experiences were being heard for the first time. So that's never happened in my research before. I think a lot more people have read this, a lot more people have engaged with it, and a lot more, well, it's never happened before. People have actually written to thank me and just to say it's really important research and glad we've done it and it's out there for other people to read.
Yeah, I mean, some of the best ideas are the simplest ones, right? It's just finding it. And then a sort of second point to that is, there's a ton of anecdotal evidence out there, but I'm a big fan of evidence and,
Mm.
rigorous methodologies and trying to back up all those sort of anecdotal claims with evidence so we could really translate it into what it be policy or just general daily life, really. But let's talk about your review paper in depth. And so one of the strongest themes in your paper was emotional support. You
Mm.
found that pets often became emotional anchors, providing support, companionship, even a lifeline in moments of despair. What did your findings reveal about that sort of emotional bond between a man and his dog?
Yeah, yeah. So just for a little bit of context as well, we've
Yeah,
done
yeah.
some work previously with people that had long-term physical health conditions like diabetes and heart disease. So some of the similar things came up in that research in terms of what's important for managing physical health conditions. But what really struck me was the differences, I suppose, between those two data sets. So in the review, what we found was that these people with mental health problems were often more isolated, often had more difficult relationships with friends and family members compared to those with physical health condition. So really that relationship with their animal became so much more important, so much more deeper and a more important relationship to them. And that was really, a lot of that was because they were constantly around. They were always close by. They were living in the houses with them. They didn't have to ask for that support. So often with humans, we have to ask, be able to articulate what it is we need, kind of be able to explain ourselves in a way that everybody understands. But with animals, they were always there. They didn't
Mm.
have to ask for support. They didn't have to kind of ask what it was they needed. Pets were just able to give them what they needed without having to communicate about it. And I think that was what was really different with animals. Also, people talked quite a lot about how they felt their animals could intuit when they needed support, which
Mm.
was quite interesting. So they felt that animals knew when they needed some support, but also they knew what to do to be able to support them in the way they needed to. So that was really quite interesting and stood out quite strongly from the papers that we looked at in this review.
I mean, a great quote from your review was, "They don't ask why; they just lie next to you." I
Yeah.
think that's absolutely beautiful. You know, I talk about on the podcast about my sort of issues I had with mental health, and I remember during one of the darkest moments of my life last year, you know, my mate, one of my best mates, I'm not going to name him, just came along and he just sat there with me,
Mm.
and there was no advice, no talking, just sat there. And it's amazing what silence can do and provide, that just the presence of someone or someone or some sort of living being can really be supportive in really the darkest times of your life, and no words are needed. Silence is so powerful. What do you think about sort of the use of pets as an offering for those with autism or neurodivergency, PTSD, I mean, we're probably going to talk about this later on, but more as a healthcare sort of offering on a policy sort of level? Because loneliness is on the rise as well in the UK. Yeah, talk to me about that. Talk to me about your thoughts.
Yes, I think we have to be quite careful with this because our animals aren't going to be for everybody. Not everybody would want to have a pet. They also might not be able to have a pet. So I think it's thinking about what we can learn, even as you just demonstrated really beautifully, what we can learn about what animals give to people that we might be able to do in terms of supporting other people in our life. That idea of just being there without interrupting, without trying to offer advice. People talked a lot about how pets didn't overstep boundaries. I think that's quite important, isn't it? That often that happens. Friends and family, however well-meaning, might overstep your own boundaries, so you might not
Yep.
have much control over that.
Yep.
So I think there's a lot we can learn rather than, I mean, I don't think in any of our research or any research that's been done so far would we be advocating for everybody to have a pet that's got a mental health problem. It's quite a
Hmm.
complicated relationship. And I think
Yeah.
that was something else that came out of the review. There's not a lot of good quality research out there that explains to us what it is about animals that leads to health outcomes. I think
Mm.
that's still to be conducted. We know probably the number of pets is important. There's an optimal number somewhere in the mid, not huge numbers. You know, there's just something to be said about optimal numbers of pets, but also things like how friendly the pet's perceived to be. And also people's attachment to that pet is probably really important in terms of realising the most health benefits. But at a policy level, this research
Mm.
has been taken on the research we've done before. It's been mentioned in Parliament and stuff. And it's really about understanding, trying to encourage health services as well to understand how important people's animals were to them in terms of helping them so the health services understood that. A lot of people talk to us about perhaps not going for treatment or not doing things they should do because they were concerned about who would look after their animals. So I guess understanding things like that as well in that healthcare context would be really important. Knowing how important animals are and featuring them in some way into that care planning process so
Mhm.
that they've got reassurance their pet's going to be cared for and they can kind of carry on with treatment as necessary.
So I think there's, if I'm correct, there's 2 points from that really is to, first of all, sort of understand from an outside perspective how important animals are as a companion with regards to mental health. But also secondary to that is drawing on, let's say, the skills or the benefits that a pet can provide that we could sort of utilize in our everyday
Mm.
life if we're surrounded by, you know, someone who has that sort of, you know, mental health condition or is just going through a really bad time in their life. We don't need to label it in that sort of sense. You talked about behavioral activation. Never come across that term. So please define it for us and how caring for a pet can disrupt dangerous thoughts or symptoms.
Yeah, so that was so there's two parts to that as well, I think, isn't there? So that kind of distraction role was a real key feature that we identified in terms of what people were saying that their pets were doing for them in terms of managing their mental health condition, which is perhaps different from the research we've done with people with physical health conditions. So again, it was
Mm.
about that physical proximity, about being able to kind of shake them out of circular thoughts or intrusive thoughts. They really grounded people. They felt they connected them to the place that they were in. They could distract them from suicidal thoughts or just from a general sense of feeling alone. There's some lovely stories about pets injecting humour into relationships, making them laugh by doing silly things, whatever it was, and that helped to kind of break the cycle of
Mm.
thoughts and the general sense of feeling alone. So that was a really important and quite a strong finding from the review and the qualitative work that we've done.
Mhm.
In
Mhm.
relation to behavioural activation, it was about providing a sense of routine often. So they would have to get out of bed in the morning and feed their animals, groom them, exercise them. So it was giving them, particularly with dogs, but it was giving them a really important source of motivation for routine to get out of bed in the morning to care for somebody else.
Mm, mm,
Also, with dog owners, particularly, it was around exercise. So having to take the dog out into the local area or out for walks, really, and give them motivation for exercise, which we know is really important in terms of mental health. They
mm.
also got them out into green spaces and nature, which we know again is people feel is very beneficial for their mental health.
I have 2 points to that. I'm a big fan of Viktor Frankl, and he has the idea of that those that who have a why can live and bear almost anyhow. You know, it's sort of
Mm,
drawing from Stoicism. If someone has a purpose, and I talk a lot about purpose, if someone has a purpose, they can really have a strong foundation in their life. But you talked about, for instance, taking out your dog for a walk, and that's, not only going to bridge yourself to the outside world, which your review also talks about, but it gives you exercise, form of exercise. You're going out,
mm,
and that's really interesting because one of the first episodes I've done on this podcast with Dr. Hurd from UCL is that we were looking at the benefits of physical activity in depression. Looking at the effects on dopamine signaling and how it could be even more beneficial than SSRIs. And
mm.
so that sort of, I guess, if anyone does have a pet and is going through a hard time, it's really just encouraging them to focus on that purpose, which is that pet, and taking care of it, giving them purpose, and looking after them in that sort
Yeah.
of way. Does it give them a sense of identity as well, a role almost?
Yeah, so a role was really important. That was linked quite closely to routine. In terms of identity, that was another really strong finding of this review. And again, that contrasted quite significantly with the previous research on people with a physical health condition. That pets really gave people meaning in their life, contributed to positive senses of identity, but importantly, ones that were kind of stable over time. Because often what you'll find is that if people are diagnosed with any form of condition, it can have an impact on people's identity, their sense of who they are, their hopes for the future, their expectations. All that is kind of shifted. And there's a term around biological disruption
Hmm.
that's been
Hmm.
researched. And what pets can do is provide continuity. So elements of their pre illness identity are still supported afterwards as someone who's an animal lover, who's someone who can look after their pet well. So it really did mediate how they saw themselves in terms of identity. Someone who's caring, an animal lover, those bits of their identity could be sustained or continued post diagnosis, which was really important in terms of their own sense of self.
So is it, if I got this correct, that a diagnosis could potentially take that sort of identity away from a patient where they sort of lose
Elements of
themselves?
it, yeah, elements of it. And it's things like your expectations for the future, your future plans. If you're diagnosed with a condition which affects that, then quite a lot of that identity, hopes for the future, understanding that all that's disrupted. So recovery and part of that is about reassessing those expectations, reassessing the sense of who you are and providing a meaningful way forward, if you like, in terms of your.
You mentioned physical and mental sort of conditions.
Mm.
Are there differences between the two in how a pet can influence a person who has either sort of ailments?
If you look across the themes, they seem relatively similar, but actually, when you look more closely, it's the salience, the significance that people are attaching to different elements of that relationship are really quite different. So, for people with a physical health condition, they really foregrounded things like connection to others as being the primary benefit of pet ownership. So, keeping them connected to others in the community or keeping them connected to other people on things like dog walks. And they also highlighted exercise. If you then look at the people with mental health difficulties, it was much more that one-to-one connection that was important, that depth and reliability and trust in the relationship with their pet that was much more highlighted in when they talked about them compared to people with physical health conditions. So it was more that one-to-one connection with that group that was more important. It was more important, and often that was because the people in these studies had or reported quite difficult relationships with friends and family members, a lot of judgment, a lot of feelings around support being conditional on certain things, and a lot of negative attitudes, really, a lack of understanding within friends and family members, which meant they were much more reliant or placed much more value on the relationship with their pets. That's what we felt.
Do you think animals can't really cast judgment on you? If I go to my cat and I say I did something wrong or something I'm ashamed of, the cat's not going to have a go at me. It's gonna look at me and it's gonna probably ask for a treat or something,
Yeah.
but it's not going to care, right? Do you think that's purely like the reason that from like a psychological perspective, let's not delve into the mechanistic or the cellular mechanisms, but on the psychological level, is it just that lack of judgment where we could tell the animal anything, we can trust them with the truth, with anything, because they can't speak, they're not at that sort of metacognition level as to us.
Yeah, but and I think people talk quite a lot about the simplicity of relationships with animals, a real lack of complexity compared to relationships with other humans, which I'm sure everybody can understand. But it's right, it's that lack of judgment, but that lack of conditionality to
Hmm.
support as well. And fear of judgment was huge when people talked about it. And like, there's a lovely quote in there as well that they don't judge, they don't look at the scars on your arm, they just accept
Yeah,
you for who they are. Like you said, they
yeah.
probably just want feeding, and there's something lovely about that, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think deep down, the best relationships I've had in my life are with those who don't judge you, who just
Mm.
accept you for who you are and they don't try to change you. It's just acceptance is probably the one thing that us as human beings is just crave, really. Do you think as well, with the rise of social media and technology, are we just getting lonely as well? Are we lacking connection with humans around us? And we're sort of other forms of connection, but we can't have it. And so maybe a pet is a sort of good substitute for that.
I mean, that's what people said. There was an authenticity to their relationships with their animals. It was didn't need to be articulated. It was simple. It was there all the time with having to ask for it. And
Mm,
that lack of a fear of judgment was so important because it surprised me really when people talked about how even close family members and friends didn't understand their
mm,
mental health problems, and they felt in order for a relationship to be supportive, there needed to be that shared understanding in terms of what their mental health was like, what their experiences were like. There's another quote in the review that says that these people are on one side and they're sending smoke signals to health professionals. They still don't understand each other. So that lack of understanding was really important as well. And I think when they talked about their pets, they either described the pet as already having that without needing to be told, or actually didn't matter so much that they didn't understand that. It was the one type of relationship where that was less important. And perhaps because of that simplicity.
Were there any examples where someone avoided suicide or harm because of a pet?
So there was one study in the review, I think, where there was a participant who talked about having to look after I think it was their rabbits they had, but they said that it reduced their suicidal ideation. But again, that wasn't anything that was measured. And I think, again, it's something we need to be quite careful about
Mm.
because the research wasn't out there to support that. But there was some anecdotal evidence within included studies that people felt that they helped in that regard. We've got some research coming out at the moment led by one of my PhD students of looking at the relationship with young people, pet ownership and self-harm. So hopefully that might be a bit more illuminating.
I think it comes back maybe to that source of purpose. I spoke to Professor Pooja, who works in acute suicide prevention down in Liverpool. And, she was talking about how when she worked with people at the brink, it was reminding them that they have a family and they have friends and reminding them that, if they did go and harm themselves, what would happen to the people who love them and, their family. And I think maybe a pet is almost similar in that sense because a pet is a source of responsibility.
Mm.
So it adds that sort of another pillar, let's say, of purpose to a person's life, which could be really helpful. I don't know the biology or the physiology in depth with regards to a mother and a child. I presume oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine are all sort of playing a role in this, which sort of delineates this bond of love between a parent and a child. Do you think something similar occurs with a person and their pet?
It's possible. I suppose a lot of people in the research that we've looked at or reviewed, people would often talk about their animals like that, my little boy, my little baby. So there's something
Mhm.
going on there in terms of that relationship. And some research will say that kind of pets are family members, but actually some of the work that we've done is they're quite unique in terms of the role they're playing. Probably isn't just a substitution for families. It's a unique role. And something that you mentioned before in terms of purpose that's quite important to flag, I think, is that the notion of reciprocity in relationships. So we know that being diagnosed with either a physical or mental health relationship impacts on your relationships. You often feel like you've become a burden on other people, whereas you might have been the
Mm.
kind of primary caregiver in that relationship before. So there's a big shift in terms of relationships. People start to become burdens, like start to feel like they're becoming a burden. And in those relationships with pets, there was much more balance, much more reciprocity in terms of they needed their owners as much as their owners needed them. So people would talk a lot about that as well in terms of balance and reciprocity in that relationship that perhaps was lacking now in other relationships.
Yeah, I think drawing again from my conversation with Professor Puja about this, we were talking about James Place, which is the charities for men's health, men's mental health. And I think if I remember the figure, 11% of those that came into James Place for help cited that they had a mental health condition, but the rest came in because they had failed relationships, they were going through divorce, stressful work. And it was that sort of lack of purpose, I think, in a man's life. I can only speak from a man's perspective,
Mhm.
that sort of led to those sort of depressive symptoms. And I think I can relate to that on somewhat on a level. I remember when I was going through a dark time, someone someone needed something from me. They were asking for help for something. Within that moment, something clicked, and suddenly I was like, right, get out of bed, let's get to work. Sort of thing. There was that sort of sense of purpose, that sense of need. And maybe that's what's happening with pets as well. That sense of purpose to take care of this tiny little thing or big, whatever animal it is. So it's powerful what, an animal can do.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So people would talk about how pets mediated, how their relationship mediated how they saw themselves, which is exactly
Mhm.
what we're talking about. But also there was a sense about how they mediated how other people saw them. So they felt like if they were
Mm,
seen as someone who was like looking after a pet well, then that was a sense of pride, and they would see that people valued that and respected that. So it's really nuanced and complicated, but really, like you say, important.
yeah, I guess a sense of a certain level of responsibility is required to, take care of a pet. And so
Yeah.
that comes with an element of, I don't want to say respect, but some sort of um, mutual agreement when you see someone with a pet, like, okay, you've taken care of this dog, you groom it, you look after it, you take it on walks. That means you have some sort of element of responsibility.
Mm,
So, yeah, it's that sort of subconscious social signaling, let's say.
yeah.
I guess also pets can help humans reconnect with the world. And I think this is really important when it comes to depression as well, because in depression, there's this negative feedback loop where you don't feel great. So you don't want to leave your room. So you stay in your room. And before you know it, you're 2 months in your room, not looking after yourself. And so, can animals be that sort of bridge where humans can then reconnect with the world and with each other?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a lot of different ways in which people felt their animals were helping them do that. So the first one was around improving existing relationships, so enhancing relationship between the spouse or with children, that having to shared responsibility of looking after a cat or a dog, for example, was seen to improve that relationship. So they really helped in terms of improving existing relationships, but they were so important about developing new ones as well. So when people were out and about, or people saw the cat in the local area, there was conversations that were sparked that wouldn't have happened previously, and not
Mm,
about illness. So that's what's really important as well. It wasn't a conversation or a relationship that was solely based on having a mental or physical health condition. It was about the animal. It was something that was, safe and valuable to both parties. There was also something really nice about how pets, if they were with the pet, they felt more confident to speak about difficult situations with other people. So not only were they kind of enhancing the frequency of those connections, if you like, but also the quality of them. If their animal was there, they felt more likely or more confident to speak about difficult things or just engage in longer conversations that they might have done without their animal being
mm,
there. So there was lots of different ways in which people felt that pets contributed in terms of social interactions. They also connected them to things like city farms. So even if people didn't have pets themselves, that kind of idea about loving animals connected them to things like city farms or volunteering opportunities. There was lots of different ways in which the pets connected them to other people. There was also some really interesting narratives around connection to communities. So, through having to take dogs walking, for example, they would be aware of refurbishments to a local school or a local church. So, they felt much more connected to the community through going out walking the dog, for example, in that local area. So, lots of
mm.
different social benefits.
Yeah, I guess it just opens up this whole world of other relationships that you can have with people. Community. I guess I'm thinking it from a running standpoint. When I started running,
Mhm.
it was join a run club. You meet people,
Yeah.
talk to people about running on social media. What's your favorite shoes? What races are you going through? Like it creates this,
Yeah.
plethora of different things that you can do. I guess though with animals, it can provide that sense of comfort, especially if you have a lot of social anxiety.
Mm.
If you don't like talking to people, but there's some cases where you have to talk to people if you're going to the shops or whatnot. Yeah, it seems like common sense, but when you dig into it, it's actually sort of amazing how an animal can have so much benefits on
Mm.
a human being itself and or a human being who's, suffering from any sort of mental health sort of or physical health ailment. But there are downsides, which
Yeah.
you didn't shy away from. So
No.
there's losing an animal. I've got to be careful here. It can be similar, let's say, to losing a person, depending on
Yeah.
how you see it. I'm not going to put my own personal, opinion on that, but it could be. So you've got grief, you've got guilt, in case you could have saved that animal, let's say. Financial strain is a big one.
Yeah.
How should we hold space for the fact that something can be deeply healing, but also can be a source of an emotional risk? But with that, anything you can do is a risk. If you go into a relationship, that's going to be a risk. If you start a new business, that's going to be a risk. If you move to a different country, that's going to be a risk. You just sometimes got to take the plunge as a value-based decision. But talk to me about the disadvantages.
Yeah, and there were a lot, and everything is a balance, isn't it? I think
Mm-hmm.
the things you've mentioned, like financial cost, but emotional investment,
Mm.
the time spent training, supporting, there can be tie-in. So there was a few people that mentioned pets almost like blocked aspirational recovery goals, like wanting to travel when they were feeling better, after that was difficult if they had a pet to look after.
Mm-hmm.
Those elements were in the minority, and it's important to say that most people that are included in these research projects have come forward because they've got a relationship with an animal they want to talk about. So I think probably that's going to mean it's a certain type of people. These people have already got successful relationships with their pets. So not a lot of research is focused on relationships that haven't worked out or relinquishment, which is another whole area. The issue and the risk around pet loss really struck me because I did a lot of these interviews and the empirical work that we did myself. So I was sitting with people with their animals, and it was very, very apparent how much they relied on their animal. And it was something that concerned me leaving, that what would happen to this person if people are sitting there and telling you that this is the reason I get out of bed in the morning, this is the reason, this is my only source of support. It concerned
Mm-hmm.
me straight from the outset about what would happen. I
Mm-hmm.
think if you look at the research, what people will do reflect on longer term is that after those initial stages of grief, they can still take joy, they can still take comfort in the memories of those relationships. Often people will get new animals. Some people talked about, particularly younger people, that they help them to manage their experience in the future of difficult circumstances because they've been through that very upsetting time. I think there's real implications for health services here, and I guess this is where we need to make sure that, and people talked a lot about this, they wanted the health professional to understand them. And often that
Mm-hmm.
was quite difficult with the limited time we have to talk to health professionals in the world that we live in at the moment. Even just understand this person had a pet they relied on, it would help them to understand that if that animal was lost, this can have a huge impact on that person. So I think there's
Mm-hmm.
implications across the board for us to understand how important these pets are for some people. Myself included, my pets are really important to me, and losing them was horrific. And I wouldn't like anyone to tell me that it's not as bad as losing,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. So it's about understanding that individual and the relationship they had with their animals and the impact it's likely to have on them.
Do you think, as a society, do we take it seriously, the grief inflicted by losing a pet? I mean, even if you lose someone now, it's a bit sort of, yeah, you get a week off work. That's all right. Go back, sort of thing. Yeah. I mean, do you think we need to pay more attention to it?
I think it's about understanding people's experiences. And I know
Mm.
things are getting better. So I was a trustee previously for the Society for Companion Animal Studies, and they've done a lot of lobbying around pet friendly employers. So giving resources out to employers so that they understand the bond that people can have with their animals and the impact it's going to have if that bond is lost. So I
Mm.
think things are getting better with charities like this that are kind of lobbying. It's housing as well. There's lots of different ways in which it's not understood, and I think there's lots of things that can still be done in relation to support for people with companion animals, particularly when they're lost.
I'm going to play devil's advocate because I like
Mm.
playing devil's advocate.
Okay.
Have you watched The Office?
The UK one?
The US
No,
one.
I've not watched the US one.
Oh my god! So there's a scene in the office when I think two of the workers are pregnant. They just had a child. They're looking after a child, and there's another guy also sitting in the office, and he has a dog, and they're all complaining about how it's very troublesome to look after his kid, because it's exhausting and all of that. And the guy chimes in and goes, yeah, the same thing happens with my dog. It's an absolute, it's a pain, but I love my dog. Trying to relate onto a level, and the two women just looking at him just like, I don't know. I don't know about that. My point being, do you think there's a limit where we might be humanizing animals too much, despite their benefits? But, playing devil's advocate, do you think there is a limit?
In what respect? In terms of the
Just how society should perceive their relationship between a human and a pet. So, for instance, with grief, let's say one person might just say, "Yeah, it's your pet. Just deal with it. You didn't lose someone. Be grateful," sort of thing. Again, playing devil's advocate, I don't agree with that. But
yeah.
there are people out there who do that. And, I've heard some people wanting to go and have leave to take care of their pets, almost like a maternity leave, but probably not for 6 months. But, so do you think we're pushing it or not? Just
I mean, in terms of policies, I'm not sure of that. I don't know about those individual
more as a
examples
cultural.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
I think the problem comes in one size fits all approaches and trying to assume that everyone experiences things like mental and physical health in the same way.
Yeah.
And I think it's naive to think that some people will prefer certain types of support than others. And I think it's about understanding the range of different things that people can draw on to get support from, and not judging those, and about understanding and supporting, and because they're valuable assets for people, it's about how can we harness those in the best possible way and support those people to stay together. I'm not sure about the leave. That's a question for somebody else. But I suppose for me, it's about taking a broad approach to understand how people manage health and illness.
Yeah.
What we can learn about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. It's context. I was speaking to Professor Harry Sumnall last week about drug prevention, drug use, and impact on policy, and how we should have more compassion towards just people in general, because we don't understand their context, the situation they're in, and what they have to do. And I think that's something that can be applied to every aspect of anyone's life, is that we need to understand context and the reasoning behind why someone is doing something or doing a certain action before, like you said, jumped into that sort of one size fits all generous approach and judging people.
Yeah.
So yeah, devil's advocate, because I like to play devil's advocate. And that scene from The Office just popped up, and I love The Office. Let's talk about co-regulation. The idea that our nervous systems can calm down in the presence of others who are safe. That's really interesting, because when I was a kid and I was around my dad, around my mum, it was that element of safety. I felt safe. They didn't need to say anything. I felt safe. And I've had that when I've gone out with my boys as well. It's like I'm with my boys, I'm safe with them. Like, it's there. So is that the same with pets, where they can be co-regulators, protectors, confidants? What do animals give us that actually humans may not, in that sort of sense?
Yeah, again, I get it. It depends. And one of the key things that people talked about in this review is about trust. And I think it's about understanding what people value in relationships and what's important to them. And perhaps with this group, they talked a lot about the trust in their relationship with their animals. And that was often because they compared it with other humans, the family members, friends, but where that had been eroded over time. Perhaps because of past judgments, past experiences, even with their own behaviour because of their mental illness. That trust had gradually been eroded. People overstepped boundaries because of that. They didn't want to open up. So it was that trust, I think, was really important, but also that dependability of relationships. Pets were really something they could rely on. Confident was an example they used a lot as well, but that reliable, trustworthy source of support. And that meant they were particularly valuable. We know that from the wider literature, often when we're going through crises, we'll reduce our social networks, we'll go into kind of isolation. And in some respects, for some period of time, that can be helpful. But actually what you'll find is that the pet doesn't get pushed out because the pet lives with them. So they transcend even that period of isolation during crisis. So they're uniquely positioned to be able to continue giving support in times of crisis when perhaps other people have either self-isolated or have chose to not give support anymore.
It's almost as if your pets and you become a team and you go
Mm.
through everything together. Yeah, I can see how it's difficult, losing the pets. So you performed these interviews with all of these people. What was anything like super surprising came out?
I suppose because I'd done the previous research with people with physical health conditions, and I'd probably got one dog at my own at that point in time myself, I was kind of expecting some levels of benefit when I spoke to people with mental health difficulties and perhaps an elevated level of support. I was kind of really surprised by the depth of connection and that
Mm,
singular reliance often. So we'd start these interviews with three concentric circles and ask them to plot the important people, places, and things around them, purposefully inclusive. They could put anything on there they wanted. It could be reading, whatever it was. And sometimes, you might have 17, 20 different things on those network diagrams, as we call them. But for this group of people, they were much smaller. So it might be that their pets, maybe one or two health professionals, that would be the kind of the entirety of their network, if you like. That helps to illustrate the difference. So this group of people were often much more isolated. And it was the depth of connection, but the range of different ways in which their pets were contributing, which surprised me, and particularly the stuff around practical works, into like helping with the experience of symptoms. I suppose really surprised me. I wasn't expecting that level of support.
I'm thinking out loud at the moment. Do you think, so forgive me if this doesn't make sense, do you think the impact of a pet would be different on, let's say, an owner who's single or an owner who's in a relationship? Are there any sort of differences in dynamics, let's say, within the relationships between these three individuals, if we were to make assumptions?
So I think what we can say from the review that we did was that it wasn't that people were saying that relationships with humans were awful. When they were good, they were obviously incredibly supportive as well. I think where relationships with pets got more salience and more importance was when those relationships were absent or difficult, if that makes
Mm,
sense.
yep, yep,
So it
yep.
wasn't like if you had a dog, you didn't need support from your wife, for example, or vice versa. It was more that they were always important, but so were humans. But when that relationships with humans were absent or difficult, the value that was placed on relationships with pets became more important.
Do you think maybe if someone was in a relationship and it wasn't going too well, they would rely too much on an animal, and that would not
Yeah.
force them to work on their relationship? Again, this is
Oh
all
yeah, I don't know.
assumptions.
That's not something we've looked at.
Yeah, it's
I
just
suppose what
assumptions.
yeah, what we know from the wider field is that social networks, that's what we call them, those constellation of important people, places, and things. They're very dynamic and responsive to changes in circumstances. So there's not like the fixed things. So I think the support from different people, places, and things around you will change in response to your personal circumstances. So you might get more support when you need it from certain people. Couldn't comment on the relationship one.
Your paper covers, different animals: dogs, cats,
Oh,
birds, rabbits. Do you think different species offer different kinds of supports, or is it purely just that relationship with a pet? Or is it something broader than that when we're talking about the type of pet that it could, I mean, if you've got a Labrador, it's going to be going off crazy or golden retriever, whatnot, compared to a goldfish, which is just going to be, in its bowl. So what's the role of an animal in sort of shaping this emotional or practical connection?
so there isn't any research out there yet that I know of that's compared directly the role of different species or different type or breeds or anything like that particularly. What we know from the review that we did is that the perceived friendliness of the animal is
Mm,
quite important. And again, there wasn't anything really definitive in terms of the type of animal. What we know is that certain types of animal confer certain types of benefits. So dogs, for example, are a really good example in terms of walking connections to other dog walkers, those types of things.
mhm.
What really came out as more important from the review that we did is what you can do with pets is choose a pet based on your unique circumstances. So not everybody's going to be able to have a dog or a horse. They're kind of high maintenance, certainly in terms of cost and everything else. And you also need a house with a garden most of the time. So, but people could get different types of pets and confer some benefit from those: goldfish, birds, whatever it is, hamsters. And actually, they were getting quite high levels of support from different species because that it was possible for them to keep those animals in a way that was appropriate.
Mm.
We can't do that with our family members so much, can we, in terms of selecting those relationships?
Yeah, 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 no. No, exactly. If someone is well, if someone's listening to this, someone listens to this is struggling with their mental health right now. What do they? What do you hope they can take away from this conversation, from this piece of work? They don't need to be a pet owner, because we talked about how someone can support someone like an animal in
Oh,
a way. So yeah, what could they take away from this?
well, I hope that they know that people are starting to understand now that bond that people can have with their animals and how important it is to both parties. I think that's really encouraging to me that this area of research is growing and people are increasingly recognizing the importance of that therapeutic relationship, that bond, that human animal bond, and that is growing and being increasingly recognized, which is really important. And I think, like you said, if that person does want to have some kind of interaction with animals but possibly can't have a pet themselves, it's about thinking about creative ways that they can do that. There's lots of animal shelters at the moment looking for dog walkers, or
Mm,
city farms looking for volunteers. So it's thinking about ways that you can, if you want to, that you can incorporate those interactions into your life in a way that's going to work for your individual circumstances.
oh, so I guess like I don't know. Can you volunteer at like animal shelters?
Yeah,
Is
to
that a
walk the
thing?
dogs. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess that's a sort of, let's say, cheat hack in having a pet without sort of experiencing all the negatives or the disadvantages when it comes to financial strains and whatnot. Oh, I didn't think about that. I might do that myself.
Yeah, no, it's great. I know a lot of my friends do that here.
What are you working on at the moment, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so this is a kind of one little part of my research, but in terms of this research, I mentioned my PhD student, Emily Vickery. She's just won an award from the Society for Companion Animal Studies, and she's looking at young people who self-harm and how their
Mm.
animals kind of are implicated in managing that self-harm behaviour. So that's what we're working on at the moment in terms of this research.
Do you think, I mean, thinking off the top of my head, designing this study would be a pain, but do you think we could sort of delve into what's happening on sort of a structural level or cellular level in those with pets? Could be possible, anything's possible, but is it
Yeah.
worth, is it, I think it's worth it, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's not my area, but I know there is work going on in that area in terms of understanding the mechanisms through which we think this operates. And I think as long as we're doing that
Mm,
alongside keeping people's voices at the forefront of that research as well, so we can understand what it's like from their perspective, that can only
mm.
strengthen the evidence base, I think, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I'm sort of really interested in sort of neuropsychology. The
Mm,
cell biologist in me really loves to understand cellular mechanism, and what's happening. But then at the same time, I think it's important for us as, let's say, cell biologists to talk to psychologists and understand that sort of link as well, and bridge it together to be like, okay, how are these changes at a cellular level linked to what's happening on a psychological level with regards to the actual person and their thoughts and their mind. So yeah, it'll be super cool to do. But yeah, I mean, this has been super fun, super exciting, and hopefully more research will go into this because I think it's
mm.
really important. So yeah, thank you for coming on, and it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's been great speaking to you.
Awesome, awesome.